There are many similarities between the two motorcycles that we have here today. For example, they both have very old British badges on their tanks, but they're actually thoroughly modern machines. Both of them make exactly 40 horsepower from their liquid-cooled single-cylinder engines, and both of them have a starting price of under rupees 2.4 lakh rupees, and both of them are fully manufactured here in India. Now, given the fact that the Triumph Speed 400 and the new Royal Enfield Guerrilla 450 are so similar on paper, it's no surprise really that one of the biggest questions we've been getting online these days is, which one is better? Well, after having ridden both these bikes intensively for a few days now, I can tell you that the answer is not that straightforward, because both machines have quite a few appealing pros and a few cons. On the topic of pros, one of the biggest appeals of the Triumph Speed 400 when it came out last year was its design. Lovely, clean, modern retro British design and beautiful attention to detail. You'll remember how we loved the sort of bolts and fasteners that Triumph used, and to date, this bike has the best attention to detail of any made in India motorcycle, including the new age Royal Enfields. It really is that nicely put together. But when you park this motorcycle next to the Guerrilla, you start to notice that it doesn't really have that much presence. Now, this is not a small motorcycle to sit on. Even someone tall like myself will be very comfortable on this bike. We'll show you the riding position in a bit. The problem is the sense of proportion. Now, the fuel tank, for example, is long, but it's really slender. It doesn't stick out very much. Same goes for the tail of the motorcycle. Very slender. The widest part of the bike is, in fact, the seat. So what you have is a motorcycle that has a slender, stretched out look, and it doesn't really have that much street presence. The Enfield, on the other hand, fixes these issues. Now, the tank is much wider. Ironically, this is a smaller fuel tank than the Speed 400, only 11 litres, that is 13 litres. But from the rider's point of view, when you just look at the motorcycle, this is a wider, more chunky fuel tank. The same goes for the rear section. I think they've done a wonderful job with these panels, very much like the Himalayan. They actually may look even better on the Royal Enfield here. So in general, this is a more funky, youthful design, and I really like it. Quality levels all around are also quite nice. The bikes are put together well, nice attention to detail in things like this plastic panel here. We have complained about this gap in the headlamp panel when we rode the bike in Spain. I also don't like the stamping in the exhaust out here. Royal Enfield says they put that there for regulatory requirements, but Triumph seems to be able to manage a very clean look on the exhaust, and I wish Royal Enfield could do that as well. But in general, this feels like a nice, solid motorcycle. One thing that's worth pointing out though is that this pretty tail section, not so functional in the monsoon. I rode here in the wet this morning and all the filth from the road was flung right onto my backpack. It is now brown, it should be black. That is something that you will have to learn to live with this motorcycle, because there's no tire hugger as such. I can understand why Royal Enfield has done that, because one of the big design aspects on this bike is the chunky tires. Biggest tires on any Indian motorcycle, 120 section front, 160 section rear. It really looks good, but it comes at the cost of practicality. It's going to throw a lot of muck onto you, and it's going to make your motorcycle quite dirty in the monsoon as well. The Triumph is more practical in that regard. Right, so that's what the Enfield looks like. This is how it feels to sit on the motorcycle. Now, like I told you, this is a nice view. It's a good feeling between your legs as well. You feel like you're on a pretty large and substantial motorcycle. It is 185 kilos, which is 9 kilos more than the Triumph, but it has the lowest seat in the segment. This is just 780 mm. That was very low in any case, 790 mm. This is 10 mm lower, and it really is a very friendly motorcycle. I have a Himalayan as my long-termer. I just got off that bike onto this, and it feels so much smaller and easier to manage, especially picking it up off the stand. Many people are going to like this. People who are put off by the Himalayan will really find this to be quite friendly. Then there's a handlebar. Now, the Guerrilla has a really nice wide handlebar. It's quite high up. It puts you in this upright body position, but also wide arms, elbows out. It feels good, makes you feel connected with the motorcycle. As for the foot pegs, they are a little higher than the Triumph. I am 6'1" and I don't find myself cramped in this riding position unless I've been on the bike for quite a few hours. And when that happens, it's not the foot pegs that are the main issue, it's the seat. You don't have a lot of room to move around. It's not completely locked in, but it's not very spacious either. But the seat starts to feel a little uncomfortable. With a better seat, this bike would really be very comfortable, because we'll talk about the suspension in a while. Let me show you what the Triumph looks like now. This motorcycle has a more neutral riding position. The foot pegs are a little lower, everything is a little more relaxed on this bike, and the seat is more spacious as well. It's also a more comfortable seat for shorter durations. Now, I already told you that the Triumph's handlebar is a little lower, it's not as wide as the Enfield. I don't mind this position for shorter durations, but I find that after a few hours, it seems to put a bit of strain in my shoulder blades. Now, that could be just down to the shape of me and how I sit on the motorcycle and how my shoulders interact with the handlebar. But I found that the Royal Enfield's riding position is a little more comfortable. The other thing I want to talk about with the riding position now, I touched on this earlier about the Triumph's look, but when you sit on the bike as well, the tank feels really slim between your legs and it doesn't feel like a big motorcycle. Again, it feels very compact, and that has benefits for newer riders, shorter riders, less confident people, but it doesn't have that big bike feel, which the Guerrilla executes a little better. Either way, both these riding positions are very comfortable, but there is one other aspect of comfort that both bikes take a different route to, and that is suspension. Now, let me give you a visual demonstration. Both bikes have their monoshock set to the minimum level out of the factory, and you will see there's a big difference in how soft they are. That's the Triumph, and this is the Enfield. You can see that the Enfield is visibly firmer than the Triumph. Now, when we rode this bike in Spain, I had some apprehensions about how comfortable it would be. The Hunter did not turn out to be a comfortable bike on our roads, and I was worried that Royal Enfield had made the same mistake here. But the Guerrilla has two things going to its advantage. For one, there is more suspension travel than the Hunter. You've got 140 mm at the front, which is the same as the Triumph, but 150 mm at the rear, whereas the Triumph has 130 mm. That is the first difference. The second difference is that this is premium suspension componentry. Showa suspension at both ends, much better than what you get on the Hunter, and you feel it. Now, yes, this is a firmly set up motorcycle, but it manages to do that while being quite plush on our roads. To give an example of why I think this is more comfortable than the Triumph in terms of suspension, Mumbai's roads are now ravaged by the monsoon. We have massive potholes that are then shabbily filled with tarmac, and this tarmac exists about 1 inch higher than the road. So you've got these raised patches all over the place. And on the Guerrilla, I keep thinking, oh, that's going to hurt. But the suspension takes it all in really well. It soaks in what the road has to offer, giving you a lot of feedback, but not hurting you in the process. As for the Triumph, it is a lot softer. Now, when we rode this bike the first time around, we really did like the ride quality. It is a comfortable motorcycle. But in comparison, you realize that the suspension is moving a lot more. It sometimes kicks you up a little more. There's more rebound happening. It just feels softer, and at higher speeds over worse surfaces, that softness is a negative. So overall, in terms of suspension comfort, the Triumph is okay, but the Guerrilla is definitely doing a better job. And then you start to get the advantages of that firmer suspension setup in the handling aspect. With those blocky wide tires, I was a little concerned about how well this bike would handle, but riding it in Spain was amazing. So much fun, and that transfers over to India as well. The first thing you will notice when you sit on this bike is that it has a really light steering feel. There's very little effort in just moving the handlebar around. The Triumph steering is heavier and slower compared to the Guerrilla, which is ironic given that this bike has wider tires and it weighs more than the Triumph as well. It is a more agile feeling bike in general. It is more willing to corner. It enjoys cornering. You want to go out there and attack a set of bends. The Triumph is very competent. It's a good handler, but it feels like it was built to be able to do it, while the Guerrilla was built to enjoy doing it. The same theme continues with the braking. Now, the Triumph has a good braking setup, strong performance, reassuring performance. You never feel like it's inadequate. But the Guerrilla is just a little more connected, better feel at the lever, better performance. Our test numbers were really good. And with that suspension setup, the whole braking setup works really well as well. In fact, that's a nice time to point out that while the Triumph has the USD fork that the spec sheet worshippers will love, the actual setup on the Royal Enfield feels better to me. So, better kit, better feel. You decide what's more important to you. As we said at the beginning of the video, both engines are quite similar on paper. This is 400cc, that's about 452cc. Both make 40 horsepower at 8,000 RPM. The Royal Enfield has a slight torque advantage, a little more torque at a little lower RPM, which you would expect given the fact that it's a bigger engine. But in reality, both these motors perform quite differently out in the real world, and in many ways, the Triumph is the better engine. For one, it's a more tractable engine in the city. You can hold 1 or 2 gears higher than the Enfield without protest. That is a really nice thing. The other nice thing in the city is that it has a lighter clutch, it's a thinner lever, less effort on your fingers. So when you're riding through traffic, you've got a smaller bike, a more compact bike, a lighter bike, and a bike with a more flexible engine. All those things are nicer than the Enfield in the city. Then you get out onto the highway and you'll find that the Triumph's engine again is smoother at higher speeds. Now there are vibrations that build up at really high speeds, 120 plus, but from 100 to 120 kilometers now, this engine feels smoother and you will feel less vibrations. Then there's the fact that it's also a little more fuel efficient than the Royal Enfield, both in the city and out on the highway. And considering that this is a larger fuel tank, you will be covering considerably more distance between fuel stops compared to that motorcycle. As for actual performance, the tested numbers are quite close. The Enfield turned out to be a little faster in acceleration. The Triumph had a small advantage in roll-on test figures, but very close. One thing to consider is that we did test this bike in damp conditions, so maybe acceleration will be a little better, but in general, the acceleration figures are quite similar. What is quite different between these two bikes though, and something that the spec sheet will never be able to tell you, is the character. The Triumph's engine is really competent, very capable, but it sort of lacks on an emotional connect, both in terms of the sound and the feel. Speaking of sound, it's a very familiar sound. We've been hearing that from other Bajaj motorcycles for quite a long time now. This is a different engine, there is no doubt about it, but the genuine sound and feel of the bike is similar and not really quite special. As for the Sherpa 450, now this is the same motor from the Himalayan, same output figures, but Royal Enfield has tuned it differently and it is a more responsive engine. That bottom end lag that you get on the Himalayan is far less noticeable here, and this engine is really much more reactive. It suits the nature of the Guerrilla very well. In fact, people who hop on this bike for the first time might find that it's a little too eager, especially when you shift from first to second gear and you cross 3000 RPM and it surges forward. It's something you need to learn to get used to. You will, and if you don't, you can always change to eco mode, which dumbs down the performance quite a bit. I don't really like eco mode because it's too slow, but you have the option and that's nice. Having lived with the Himalayan as my everyday bike for quite a few months now, I can tell you that the Sherpa 450 engine is the least characterful engine that Royal Enfield currently makes when you compare to the sweet 650 and that lovely 350 single in the Bullet Classic and others. But compared to the Triumph, this sound and feel from this engine is a little more engaging. Speaking of sound, this is what it's like. From the rider's point of view, there's a very nice intake sound. It's a more brappy exhaust sound. It sort of eggs you on, and it definitely keeps you more connected with the motorcycle. The downside of all that connection though is the vibrations. The Himalayan has a particular rev band where the vibrations get quite harsh. It's not really the case with this bike. It's just that as you go faster, you start to feel more vibes in the pegs and the seat. I also noticed something unusual with this particular bike. High RPM, the mirrors tend to just go down like that. Not something I noticed on the two bikes that I rode in Spain, so I'm hoping it's down to just this motorcycle, but that was quite irritating because every time you go fast, you've got to readjust your mirrors. That is the downside with this engine. Before we wrap up, let's just talk about features, quality and things that you get as a buyer. There's a bit of give and take on both these motorcycles. With the Speed 400, you only get an analog digital display. It's not really my favorite display out there. I would have rather had a big rev counter and a small speedometer, but it's unique and it gives you the information you need. This bike has an upside down fork, it has traction control, whereas this motorcycle comes with those really wide tires. You can get the TFT display from the Himalayan if you want. If you want to save some money, you can buy the base version with the LCD display that you see in 650 bikes like the Super Meteor and others. Then there's the fact that the Speed 400 also gets an immobilizer. It's one of the few bikes in the segment to have that feature. If you do go for the TFT display, you get that really unique ability to cast maps from your phone to the screen. You can get Google Maps on the screen. The downside is that you have to keep your phone screen on, but it still beats having to mount a phone on the handlebar, so it is an advantage. Both motorcycles also have Type-C charging ports. The Triumph has it under the instrument console and the Royal Enfield is mounted on the handlebar. And the Guerrilla comes with the main stand as standard, which the Triumph does not. It's a nice feature for home maintenance and just parking the bike in a more secure manner. Then there's the point of quality. Now, the Triumph definitely has lovely attention to detail, but over time there have been some complaints, particularly with rust, and our motorcycle also has some corrosion showing on a few bolts over there, on the radiator. Customers have complained about the indicators getting full of water. Ours are full of condensation. The Guerrilla is also showing very mild sign of condensation, but not that much. And customers have been reporting stalling issues with the motorcycle. Now that's not something we have encountered, but our bike sometimes just doesn't want to start up. You have to try 4 or 5 times before the engine decides that it will stay on. The Himalayan platform, which the Guerrilla is based on, has its fair share of issues as well. The most infamous of them all was the chassis failure, which Royal Enfield has clarified was because people were incorrectly installing aftermarket crash guards. If you want to install crash guards on this bike, a far safer bet would be to stick with what Royal Enfield has designed. But there are other issues as well. For example, the switchgear on this motorcycle is the same as the Himalayan, and that means you get that fiddly toggle switch. It doesn't really work very well, and on my Himalayan, the switch has failed altogether. It needs to be replaced. Clearly, these are two new platforms for both manufacturers, and as is always the case, there are some niggles that the companies should sort out in due course. While we're on the topic of attention to detail, I should point out that there are a few accessories on this motorcycle, including this windscreen, this extension for the front fender, and that nice solid metal bash guard. Our test Guerrilla doesn't have any accessories, but RE has a good range of accessories, well made, and these ones seem to be really nicely designed as well.
You take my breath away, got me so cold beneath the lines of your pixel face. That blurry edge is a riptide.
Okay, it's time to pick a winner here, and this is tougher than it usually is in our comparison videos because I don't think there is a clear winner here. My apologies go out to the internet. I think it comes down to what you want, which plus points are more important to you, and which negatives you are more willing to live with. For example, the Triumph is the more grown-up and sophisticated motorcycle here. I think it has the more desirable badge on its fuel tank. It's the nicer bike to commute on. It's smoother at higher speeds. There are many plus points going here. But then the Guerrilla turns out to be much more fun to ride. It has noticeably better suspension comfort, and it looks and feels like a more comprehensive motorcycle than the Triumph. When it comes down to my own decision, if I had to pick between these two, I think I would go in the way of the Guerrilla because I like my motorcycles to look and feel special, and they have to be special in the way they ride. And the Guerrilla ticks those boxes, which are the most important boxes for me. But that's me. What about you? As always, let us know in the comment section below.